Fire did not just fall that day. It hunted. It came like a judgment that knew names. It did not scatter blindly across the land it chose. It searched. It erased. Homes, laughter, markets, voices, all swallowed in a moment so violent that even centuries later, men still whisper about it with unease. But here is the question that refuses to die. What really happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? Was it divine judgment? Or was it something else, something buried beneath ash, salt, and silence? And it all begins in a land that once looked nothing like death. Long before destruction ever found it, the region around the Dead Sea was rich, fertile, and alive like the garden of the Lord. Among those cities stood Sodom and Gomorrah. They were thriving urban centers, wealthy, organized, and deeply influential. Trade routes passed through them, linking Mesopotamia to Egypt. Wealth flowed in. Power followed. And where power gathers, corruption often follows quietly behind it. The Hebrew text describes a place where injustice had become normal, where the strong crushed the weak without consequence, where strangers were not welcomed but preyed upon, where power was abused so openly that it cried out. In the book of Genesis, God declares that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is grievous. So 2 messengers are sent. They arrive quietly, like ordinary travelers entering a city that does not yet know its fate. They are received by Lot, a resident of Sodom. He insists they stay under his roof, urgently, knowing the nature of the city. And that night, the truth reveals itself. The men of Sodom surround Lot's house, demanding the visitors be brought out. This shows a society where violence has become communal. And this is where the story shifts from warning to inevitability. Lot is told to gather his family. The message is simple. Leave now. The city will not survive what is coming. So the messengers take their hands and lead them out. And then comes the haunting command, do not look back. At dawn the sky breaks, fire and brimstone rain down. The cities are overthrown. Smoke rises like from a furnace. And then a single chilling detail. Lot's wife looks back. Just a glance of longing or disbelief. And she becomes a pillar of salt. The story, as told in Genesis, is powerful. But it does not stand alone. Because when we move beyond the biblical text, into history, into science, we begin to uncover something unsettling, something that suggests that whatever happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, it was not just symbolic, it was real. In the writings of Strabo, there are references to a region near the Dead Sea marked by burned land and strange formations. Even today, the southern basin of the Dead Sea is unlike most places on Earth. Thick salt deposits dominate the landscape. Some argue it was purely divine, an act of judgment beyond natural explanation. Others suggest something catastrophic, but earthly, an explosion, a meteor airburst, a geological disaster involving sulfur and bitumen deposits igniting with devastating force. Archaeological investigations in areas like Tall El Hammam have uncovered signs of intense heat so extreme it melted pottery. Could it be that the ancient account of fire from heaven was describing something witnessed but understood through the lens of the time? Sodom and Gomorrah sit at the intersection of faith, history, and mystery, a place where the earth seems to whisper in agreement. To truly understand what happened, we must go deeper into the evidence, into the clash between belief and science. Because what lies beneath this story is not just about 2 ancient cities. It is about human nature, power, pride, corruption. The ground remembers what men forget. Beneath the silence of the Dead Sea, there are fragments of a violent moment. Flavius Josephus wrote about fruits that looked edible, but turned to smoke and ashes when touched, a land altered at its core. Something happened there that changed the land itself. Modern archaeology has revealed layers of destruction that do not fit ordinary explanations. Not gradual decline, not simple invasion, but sudden, intense devastation. Archaeologists found pottery that had been partially melted, its surface transformed into glass-like textures. Mud brick structures showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, far beyond what typical fires in ancient warfare could produce. This is not the kind of damage you get from a torch or a siege. This is heat that overwhelms, heat that consumes in seconds. Some researchers estimate temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius hot, enough to vaporize materials, to shatter stone, to erase life almost instantly. And then there is another detail, one that ties eerily back to the biblical description. Sulfur. In the regions surrounding the Dead Sea, there are deposits of sulfur embedded within the earth, often in unusual concentrations. Small, round nodules of nearly pure sulfur have been found scattered across certain areas. When ignited, sulfur burns with an intense blue flame and produces a choking, suffocating smoke. In ancient language, this would have been described simply as brimstone, fire, and brimstone. The same words used in Genesis. Now pause again, because at this point the lines between ancient text and physical evidence begin to blur. Could it be coincidence? Or are we looking at two descriptions, one ancient, one modern, of the same catastrophic event? This is where the scientific debate begins to take shape. One leading theory is that this was not a traditional volcanic eruption or earthquake, but something from above, a cosmic event, specifically a meteor airburst. An airburst occurs when a meteor enters the Earth's atmosphere and explodes before hitting the ground. The explosion releases enormous energy in a fraction of a second, creating a shock wave and a burst of heat capable of flattening cities. Think of it like a silent arrival, followed by a sudden, overwhelming flash. No warning, no escape. The closest modern comparison is the Tunguska event of 1908, where a massive explosion flattened over 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Now imagine that same kind of event occurring directly above an ancient city. The blast wave alone would have shattered structures. The heat would have ignited everything combustible. The pressure could have thrown debris with deadly force. If the region contained flammable materials, the result would be a chain reaction. Fire from the sky, igniting fire from the ground. To an ancient observer, there would be no distinction. It would simply be judgment, but not all scholars agree. Some argue that Tol el Hammam may not be Sodom at all. Others suggest the destruction layers could be explained by a combination of warfare, earthquakes, and localized fires over time. And history is not built on one voice alone. It is a conversation, a tension between evidence, interpretation, and belief. Still, certain facts remain. The region shows signs of sudden, high-temperature destruction. After the destruction, the region appears to have been largely abandoned for centuries. Life did not quickly rebuild. It is as if the land carried a memory that people were unwilling to challenge. Fear has a way of doing that. When a place becomes associated with sudden, total destruction, It does not just fade from maps, it lingers in the mind. The story whispers the same question across generations. What follows next? Is it collapse from within, or something far more final? And whether the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was only about the past, or a message meant for every age that dares to listen. Stories do not survive thousands of years by accident. They endure because something inside them refuses to die, something that keeps speaking, even when the cities themselves have turned to dust. And that is where the account of Sodom and Gomorrah begins to shift from destruction to meaning. Because if this was only about fire, only about a city wiped out in a distant age, it would have faded like so many other forgotten ruins. But it did not. It was preserved, repeated, studied, argued over, and feared. So the real question begins to press harder now. Why? Why was this story told the way it was told? Why does the biblical account place so much emphasis not just on the destruction, but on the behavior that came before it? To understand that, we must return to the text itself, but this time not to watch what happened, but to listen. The book of Genesis does not present Sodom as a sudden outbreak of evil. It describes something that grew over time, a pattern, a culture. The language used is deliberate. The outcry against the city is great. The sin is very grievous. These are not casual words. In ancient Hebrew thought, an outcry often referred to the cry of the oppressed, the voice of those who had been wronged or crushed. So this was not just about private immorality. It was about public injustice. The prophet Ezekiel gives one of the most striking interpretations. Speaking centuries later, he describes its sin in a way that cuts deeper. Pride, excess of food, prosperity without compassion, a refusal to help the poor and needy. That changes the picture, doesn't it? Suddenly, Sodom is not just a symbol of shocking behavior, it becomes a mirror. Wealth without responsibility, power without restraint, comfort without conscience. It begins to feel uncomfortably familiar. Jesus Christ himself refers to Sodom as a warning, not just to ancient cities, but to those who reject truth. And the Apostle Peter describes Sodom as an example of what happens when a society becomes lawless, when boundaries collapse. So across generations, their message remains consistent. The destruction was not random. It was the end of a pattern. But when we return to the physical evidence, the heat, the sulfur, it raises a difficult question. If this was a natural catastrophe, why judgment? And if it was judgment, why does it look so much like a natural catastrophe? Faith and science circle each other here. An ancient observer sees fire falling from the sky, the ground erupting. There is no language for meteor, airburst. There is only experience, and that experience is overwhelming, terrifying, undeniable. So it is described in the only terms that make sense: divine action. But does that mean it was not real in a physical sense? Or does it mean what they witnessed was both physical and meaningful? Throughout history, people have interpreted catastrophic events not just as random, but as moments that reveal something deeper about human life. It forces a question that cannot be ignored. What kind of world are we building? And Sodom, in this light, becomes more than a city. It becomes a case study, a warning written in fire. And then there is one detail small, almost easy to overlook, but it carries a weight that lingers. Lot's wife. She looks back just once, and she becomes a pillar of salt. This moment has been debated for centuries, symbolic or literal. looking back at what should have been left behind, holding on to what was already lost. There is something deeply human in that, because even when we are told to move forward, part of us resists. Part of us turns around out of attachment, and sometimes that hesitation carries consequences. Now step back and look at the full picture forming here. A wealthy, powerful society, a pattern of injustice and moral collapse, a sudden, catastrophic destruction involving fire, heat, and sulfur. Modern archaeology uncovering signs of extreme devastation. Scientific theories pointing to a cosmic or geological event. And a story that refuses to fade because it speaks to something beyond its own time. This is no longer just a question of what happened. It becomes a question of what does it mean. Because whether you see Sodom and Gomorrah as a direct act of divine judgment, or as a natural catastrophe interpreted through ancient eyes, the result is the same. A civilization reached a breaking point, and it did not recover. And now, as we move forward, we must face the most difficult part of this entire journey. Not the fire, not the science, not even the history, but the implications. If the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just an isolated event, if it was a pattern, a warning, a reflection, then the question is no longer safely buried in the past. It stands quietly but firmly in the present, watching, waiting, as if to ask, are we so different? There is a moment in every great collapse when everything still looks normal. The markets still open, voices still rise in laughter, wealth still moves from hand to hand. From the outside, nothing seems broken, but underneath, something has already shifted, and that is the part of the story most people miss. Because Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed at the beginning of their corruption, they were destroyed at the end of it. After a long season of warning signs, ignored voices, and quiet decay, and if we are honest, that pattern is not ancient. It is timeless. Empires rise not just on strength, but on discipline, structure, and a sense of order. Consider the reflections of Tacitus, who wrote about the moral decline of Rome, not as a sudden fall, but as a gradual unraveling. Or take Plato, who warned that societies collapse when desire overtakes discipline, when people begin to chase pleasure without limit. And what they describe echoes the same pattern we see in Sodom, a society that had everything and lost balance. The area sits along a major fault line. It is a region shaped by pressure, by tension beneath the surface. Add to that the presence of bitumen natural asphalt that seeps from the ground and pockets of flammable gases trapped beneath. A place where the ground itself holds volatile materials, where pressure builds quietly, unseen, where a single trigger, an earthquake, a spark, an impact could release forces far beyond human control. It mirrors the moral landscape we have been describing. Pressure building, boundaries weakening, and then release. Whether you approach it from geology or theology, the pattern is strikingly similar. Something was building beneath Sodom physically, socially, morally. When it reached its breaking point, the result was irreversible. What if judgment does not always come as something separate from the natural world? What if it comes through it? The idea that consequences are not always imposed from the outside, but arise from within the structure of reality itself. Push far enough, and something gives. Ignore warning signs, and eventually they become outcomes. Sodom, in this light, becomes more than a target of destruction. It becomes an example of convergence. moral collapse meeting physical vulnerability, human choices intersecting with environmental risk, a moment where everything aligns and the result is catastrophic. Now consider one more layer often overlooked but deeply revealing: memory. After the destruction, Sodom and Gomorrah did not just disappear physically, they became symbols. Their names were carried forward, not as geography, but as language. To call something like Sodom was to condemn it completely. That kind of memory does not come from ordinary events. It comes from something that leaves a mark so deep that people refuse to forget it. Even centuries later, travelers moving through the Dead Sea region would point to strange rock formations, pillars of salt, twisted landscapes, and connect them to the story. Whether those connections were accurate or symbolic, they reveal something important. People believed the land itself was a witness, and perhaps, in some way, it was, because even today the Dead Sea region feels different. The air is heavy, the water is dense with salt. The shoreline shifts as the sea slowly recedes, revealing more of the barren ground beneath. It is not a place that easily supports life. It is a place that feels aftermath. And that brings us to a question that is both simple and unsettling. If Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by a unique, one-time event, then the story can remain safely in the past. But if their fall followed a pattern, a build-up, a breaking point, a release, then the story becomes something else entirely. It becomes a warning that does not expire, because patterns repeat, not in identical ways, but in familiar rhythms. Societies grow, they prosper, they drift, they ignore, and sometimes they collapse. Now, as we move closer to the final layers of this story, the focus sharpens even further. Because we have looked at the land, we have examined the evidence, we have traced the patterns. But there is still one question left hanging in the air, quiet, but impossible to ignore. If Sodom and Gomorrah were a warning, who was it meant for? Only the people of that time, or every generation that would come after? Because the truth is, a story like this does not survive just to inform. It survives to confront, and what it confronts is not comfortable. It asks whether destruction is always as distant as we like to believe, or whether sometimes it is already closer than it appears, waiting for its moment to be revealed. There is a strange comfort people take in distance. Distance in time, distance in geography, distance in consequence. Sodom and Gomorrah feel safe that way, sealed in antiquity, wrapped in dust, reduced to story. A fire in a world far removed from ours. But the closer you examine the pattern, the less comfortable that distance becomes. Because what happened there was not just destruction. It was a culmination. And culminations, by their nature, are never isolated. They are the final page of a long, unfolding manuscript. Now, to understand the final movement of this story, we have to return once more to the land itself. Because geography is not just background here, it is part of the evidence. The Dead Sea region is not ordinary terrain. It is one of the lowest places on Earth, sitting deep within a rift valley formed by tectonic forces. The Earth's crust is literally pulled apart in this area, creating fractures that run deep beneath the surface. Along these fractures, pressure builds over time, and when it releases, it does not whisper. It shakes. This is the world described in geological studies of the Jordan Rift Valley, a region marked by seismic activity for thousands of years. Earthquakes are recorded throughout its history, some powerful enough to reshape landscapes. Now combine that with what ancient observers described: a sudden destruction, fire from above, smoke rising like a furnace, a land transformed into salt and barrenness. When you place those descriptions side by side, ancient narrative and geological reality, you see why this story has never settled into a single interpretation, because both sides are speaking to something real. One speaks in the language of meaning, the other in the language of mechanism, and somewhere between the two, the event itself sits. Now consider the archaeological perspective again. Sites like Tal el-Hammam have produced layers of destruction that suggest extreme heat, instantaneous, overwhelming heat. Not the slow burn of war, not the scattered damage of conflict, but something more sudden. Researchers who study high-temperature events point out that materials behaving this way often require energy, sources far beyond conventional fire. Meteor airburst theories enter here again, not as certainty, but as possibility. A burst in the atmosphere releasing energy equivalent to a large explosion. A shock wave flattening structures. A heat pulse igniting everything combustible. In such a scenario, sulfur deposits in the region would not be incidental. They would become fuel. Bitumen from natural pits could ignite. The landscape itself would contribute to the destruction. To an ancient witness, the experience would be overwhelming. Fire falling, the ground burning, the sky seemingly active in judgment. And so the language of meaning emerges naturally, not because it is untrue, but because it is complete in its own frame of understanding. This is where the account preserved in Genesis becomes crucial again, because the text does not focus on explaining the mechanism. It focuses on the moral reality surrounding it. The story is structured around human behavior, not geological triggers. It is concerned with what led up to the moment, not just how the moment unfolded. That is why figures like Abraham play such an important role. There is a negotiation scene, quiet, almost unsettling in its calmness, where Abraham pleads for the city. If there are 50 righteous, will the city be spared? What about 45, 30, 10? It is a slow descent, a narrowing of hope, and at the end, even 10 cannot be found. This detail is not about numbers alone. It is about collapse of moral density. A society stretched so thin in its ethical structure that even a small core of restraint cannot be located. Now, whether one reads this as theology or metaphor, the structure of the narrative is intentional. It is showing a threshold, a point beyond which a system cannot sustain itself. And once that threshold is crossed, the outcome becomes inevitable. This is where interpretation divides. Some scholars see divine judgment as the primary explanation, an intentional act by God. Others see a convergence of natural disaster and social collapse, where human interpretation framed a catastrophic event in theological terms. And some suggest that the ancient worldview did not separate the natural from the divine the way modern thinking does. In that worldview, a meteor or an earthquake could still be understood as judgment, not because it was supernatural, but because it carried moral significance. This is important, because it reframes the debate. It is not simply nature versus God. It is interpretation versus mechanism, meaning versus process. Now step away from theory for a moment and return to memory again. Because Sodom and Gomorrah did not remain as a forgotten disaster. They became a reference point. Across centuries of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, their names are invoked to warn others. That kind of linguistic survival is rare. It suggests that whatever occurred there left a psychological imprint strong enough to be carried across generations. And that brings us to the uncomfortable center of this entire narrative. Beneath the debate, there is a core idea that refuses to disappear, as society can reach a point where its internal structure becomes unstable. And when that happens, whether through moral collapse or environmental vulnerability, the outcome can be sudden, total, and irreversible. Sodom and Gomorrah, in this sense, become more than ancient cities. They become a model of breakdown. Not just what was lost, but how. Now, as we move toward the final layer of this story, the focus begins to narrow. Was the destruction random in nature but interpreted as judgment? Or was it intended judgment expressed through natural forces? And perhaps more importantly, does the distinction matter as much as we think it does? For those who lived it, the experience was the same. A city gone, a landscape changed, a warning left behind in fire and salt. And that is where the final movement of this story will take us, into what this story has been trying to say, beneath every layer of ash. Not the weight of evidence alone, but the weight of meaning. Sodom and Gomorrah reach that point here. Because after all the layers we have walked through Scripture, geology, archaeology, ancient memory, scientific theory, what remains is not a neat conclusion. It is a tension that refuses to resolve. And maybe that is exactly how some stories are meant to survive. Not as answers, but as mirrors. The fire has already fallen. The cities are already gone. What is left is silence and interpretation. And silence in history is never empty. The biblical narrative closes the destruction with a simple but haunting image, smoke rising from the land, like the smoke of a furnace. In later Jewish tradition, the destruction is not just recalled, it is interpreted as evidence of moral consequence embedded in history itself. On one side, the theological reading remains firm. This was judgment, a deliberate act tied to justice, warning, and moral order. On the other side, the historical reading points to a region geologically unstable, rich in combustible materials, possibly struck by a catastrophic natural event. Human beings do not easily accept randomness when it comes to catastrophe. We search for structure in destruction. We turn events into lessons. That is how Sodom and Gomorrah became more than history. They became language, a shorthand for excess, for collapse, for irreversible decline. But the structure beneath human behavior has not changed as much as we like to believe. Power still concentrates. Comfort still dulls awareness. The ancient text answers in fire. Modern science answers in energy and impact. History answers in collapse and silence. The Dead Sea region still stands as a physical reminder, a place where salt dominates the soil, where the landscape feels like aftermath frozen in time. Sodom and Gomorrah are also about what remains after destruction: memory, warning, interpretation, and choice. What collapses suddenly is often something that has been weakening for a long time. The story ends here, not with certainty, but with awareness.